Hello. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be doing very brief overviews of different historical modes of reading or schools of literary and cultural theory. I'm going to try and cover a lot of them. Most of them will be 20th and 21st century because this is when we really had a proliferation of schools of critical thought. But in these very brief summaries, I'm going to try and give you a sense of the key ideas, key concerns, key innovations, and maybe some major drawbacks of these different schools. You'll also see that some of these schools have similar sets of concerns, and there's a lot of overlap between different approaches to literary and cultural theory, different approaches to how we read. In this video, we're going to talk about queer theory. Now, queer theory works along a lot of fairly similar principles to feminist literary criticism, except the focus is gender identity and sexuality rather than gender roles within society. Although gender roles is also something central to queer theory, obviously, because questions like questions about the trans experience, questions about non-binary, gender non-conforming people, etc., are solidly in the realm of queer theory, but draw extensively on the foundations laid by feminist critics. So essentially, queer theory is focused on the question, how is normativity constructed and enforced within a society, particularly heteronormativity. And heteronormativity is basically a fancy way of saying the societal norm is heterosexuality and cisgender gender identity, and generally monogamy, although not necessarily as much so. And monogamy is not necessarily as central, but what are the mechanisms through which society enforces this norm of, look it up, Adrian Rich has this term, compulsory heterosexuality. And this is one of the things that queer theory is very interested in, is compulsory heterosexuality. How does society enforce heterosexual desire while denigrating, demonizing, or making unthinkable same-sex desire? And how does society enforce cisgender identity, that is a gender identity that conforms with the biological sex the person was assigned at birth, as opposed to transgender identities, fluid gender identities, or other variations. The earliest phases of queer theory, there's a parallel with feminism here, because one of the things that second wave feminism did was focus on female characters and really bringing their experience to the fore. The early phases of queer theory, or really more gay and lesbian studies, as it was called in those days, did something very similar. It focused on identifying gay characters, lesbian characters, and bringing them to the forefront. So a lot of the early work of gay and lesbian studies really focused on how do we identify queer characters in literature that are not overtly coded as gays or lesbians? How do we figure out the signs? And this is actually a really important queer reading technique, is the idea that particularly prior to very recently, when we started to see more LGBT representation in popular media, in literature, etc., you often had characters that were in some way coded as gay or lesbian, and they weren't overtly identified as that. And so Gay and Lesbian Studies, this early phase of queer theory, really focused on identifying how do you read gay and lesbian characters who are not overtly coded that way, and sort of amplifying or bringing to the fore the existence of those characters as evidence that gay, lesbian, etc. people had always existed. At some point you get a shift. Really in the 80s into the 90s especially, you get the people who really shaped third wave feminism are also major voices in queer theory. People like Judith Butler, Jack Halberstam, etc., who start to say, actually, gender is not biological. Even sex is not entirely biological, and I talked about this more in my video on feminism, but the idea that gender identity and sexuality are instead repeated performances of coded behaviors. This becomes really, really central to queer theory, and this idea that you can understand heteronormativity, you can understand compulsory cisgenderism through the desire to code these experiences as biological or innate rather than as social performances, reified social performances. So that's sort of the big insight, or one of the big insights we get in the 90s, is this idea that because gender is in fact performative rather than biologically innate, that pushes back on the social compulsion to be the social compulsion to normalize heterosexuality as the default, to normalize cisgender identity as the default. These things are not innate, they are not biologically rooted in the way that heteronormative and cisgender privileging societies would tend to have us believe. So we get that major challenge. Queer theory is a massive expansion from gay and lesbian studies. There are queer theorists who take an extraordinarily broad conception of the term queer, basically almost to the extent of meaning any behavior or identity that challenges social norms. I think that's a little bit too broad a conception, but it's also not an unfounded conception of what queer theory does or should mean. Because ultimately that is what queer theory is fundamentally concerned with, is the experience of people who challenge social norms, typically in terms of gender and sexuality. That can be a very complex thing, and it can take a lot of different forms. There are big debates, possibly not as much anymore, but in the 90s, into the early 2000s, there were big debates about whether or not queer theory, whether or not LGBT identity, etc., should try and subsume itself into social norms. This is sometimes called homonormativity. There was a big push, particularly during the campaigns in the US for same-sex marriage to be legalized, and also for gays and lesbians to be allowed to serve in the military openly. There was a big push during this time for particularly white middle-class gay and lesbian people to get these markers of social status, i.e. marriage, and military service that were traditionally markers of heteronormative privilege. Again, this is sometimes called homonormativity, the idea that gay and lesbian lifestyles should conform to this and should, reject things like gay pride parades, swingers clubs, leather daddies, all of these more sort of drag shows, etc. All of these sort of more flamboyant or overtly visible, non-conforming approaches to queer sexuality, the homonormative thinkers tended to say, that's not good stuff. We should get rid of that, and we should all live sort of white bread lives in our nice suburban houses with our one single partner for the rest of our lives, etc., etc. By contrast, you had people at the same time saying, no, actually, that's the completely wrong approach. Because what that ends up doing, that homonormative approach, what that ends up doing is leaving out of social legitimacy everybody who doesn't conform to that. So, homeless people, sex workers, particularly same-sex sex workers, male prostitutes in particular, people in cruising culture or club culture, things like this, that delegitimizes the existence of all of those people in favor of privileging heteronormative norms that just get reapplied to gay and lesbian people. And so there was a big debate about what's the right approach. And that, a lot of that debate, I feel like, got kind of swept under the rug in the push for marriage equality, because that was something that most Americans, especially those outside the LGBT community, could really sort of wrap their heads around and say, okay, this is a cause that I'm willing to get behind. And so those queer voices, those queer thinkers, etc., who said, actually, privileging marriage, privileging military service, etc., does a disservice to a massive portion of the queer community, that kind of got swept under the rug. But now that marriage equality has been legalized, although, I mean, at time of filming it is, but given what the US Supreme Court is doing with taking away rights, who knows by the time this video goes up. But that was one of the big debates at the time. Another big debate was whether or not queer identities and queer culture had some sort of future or generative ability. So people like Lee Edelman, he wrote a book called No Future, where basically he says the teleology of queerness is death drive. Basically what that means is queerness is fundamentally in opposition to heteronormative culture with its eternal focus on the figure of the child, not on any actual children. Edelman is keen to point out it doesn't matter, generally speaking, for the ideology of the child, whether or not any actual child who's living dies, is underfed, is abused or neglected, whatever it is. None of that detail matters. What matters is the figure of the child. That is the imagined future. Edelman argues that heteronormative culture is entirely built on the renunciation of things today. That is, we can't use up all of the resources today because there will be nothing left for our children. We can't do as much as we want to do today because we need to preserve things for the children. Obviously, we now know, given the fact that we've ran through non-renewable fossil fuels at a rapid rate and are now facing a climate catastrophe, that maybe didn't work out as well as Edelman would give us the impression. But what Edelman argues is that queer culture, queer theory, queer people have a opposite teleology of, we're going to enjoy today because there is no child. The future is not, it's not a future-oriented existence. It is instead an existence oriented around pleasure, around enjoyment today, etc., etc. And there's a lot, Edelman is wrong about a lot of stuff. There is a particular way in which his theory is right and interesting and compelling, but it's an extremely problematic theory. And particularly, I think people who came of age during the AIDS crisis, a lot of these thinkers had this very negative perspective about queer experience because of the ravages of AIDS in the 80s and 90s. I mean, a theorist named Leo Bersani, for instance, has a book called Is the Rectum a Grave? So again, there was a lot of this really negative anxieties. More like, these are not people who are necessarily being like, being gay is bad, being LGBT is bad, being queer is bad, and we should stop it. These are people who are like, is there a future for the LGBT community? Is there a future for gay and lesbian people, etc., etc.? And they were kind of like, I'm not really sure. Now, the 90s was very much a different cultural moment than we have today. Today we have much more of a renaissance in LGBT representation, which is amazing. We also though have, particularly in the US, but in some other countries as well, theocratically based reactionary rejection of LGBT identities and rights. And that's a huge problem. And we as a society have not yet figured out how to navigate that in favor of freedom, equality, toleration, etc., etc.